Hello and welcome to the Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense attorney based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for nearly a decade. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. We are recording this on Friday, June 7th, 2024. In this week's episode, disturbing messages between the mother and grandmother of a deceased child allegedly reveal more details about the victim's tortured life and tragic end. Plus, a potential curveball in Alec Baldwin's manslaughter trial, as a witness who allegedly wants to see him in jail will be granted immunity to testify against the actor. But first, a capital murder trial is granted a brief delay as a defendant is allowed to cover up some potentially damning face tattoos. Today, I am very excited to be joined by Jessica Bowlin, a district attorney, legal analyst, and also a very good friend of mine from my time at the LA DA's office. Jessica, welcome. It's so good to see you. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. We've been trying to do this for a while. I'm glad that we were finally able to make it work. I know that you have tremendous experience, more than me. You're still at the DA's office about prosecuting these crimes. But I know that you also follow them and have a balanced take on them. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the first case out of Fort Myers, Florida, where jury selection was briefly delayed in a capital murder trial last week, as the defendant was granted a change of clothes and makeup to cover face tattoos, which included stitches and swastikas. Wade Wilson, who's charged with a laundry list of felonies, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz, appeared in court where prosecutors made it abundantly clear that the man has not been offered any plea or reduced sentencing. This was unfortunate for Wilson's defense, who have sought to keep the man off of death row after Florida's revised legislation now only requires 8 of 12 jurors to recommend the death penalty. Wilson's trial is expected to last about 3 weeks, and we will keep you updated as the proceedings and any potential makeup tips as the trial advances. First, Jessica, I wanted to get into this change in the law in Florida. So in most jurisdictions where we operate out of here in Los Angeles, in order to get a death verdict, you have to have not only unanimous on the guilt phase, but unanimous on the penalty phase to recommend death. However, in Florida, they changed the law. And this was in response to the Parkland school shooting, where the defendant in that case got LWOP instead of the death penalty on a 9-3 vote. And that frustrated a lot of people in that state. And people across the country thought that if anybody's going to get the death penalty, that would be the case. But what are your thoughts on this? What do you do? How do you respond to this?
Well, the national standard really is a unanimous vote. There are only 2 states now that don't require unanimity for a death penalty verdict. And that's Alabama, which is 10. They will allow 10-2. For death penalty, and now Florida, 8-12. I don't agree with it. I think the death penalty is the ultimate punishment, and that we should follow with the norms of the rest of the country for a unanimous verdict. I understand the reaction, like you were saying, to the Parkland case, where 9 voted for death and 3 didn't. You would say if anybody deserved the death penalty, it would be somebody who killed 17 people. But in most cases, that's not the case. And I think there's some legal issues with having an 8-12 ratio for guilt, for death penalty.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this is a brand new law.
Right.
My understanding is this might be one of the first cases that tests it. So I'm positive that if he actually is given the death penalty on this case, that will be issue number 1 on their appeal. And you can guarantee this is going to be appealed regardless. But, I guess I agree with everything you're saying too. And I understand people's frustration, but my problem is that whenever you have legislation in response to a case, it seems like legislation based on frustration and based on emotion rather than kind of a very deliberate and thoughtful way of coming up with a law. How about you?
I agree. And the American Bar Association has pointed to empirical studies that when we require unanimity, a jury is more likely to spend more time considering the issue. They're less likely to be overcome by another juror. And I think when you divide it up like that, it creates an issue. And I can see this being appealed all the way up.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a feeling that this may not stand as a law. Certainly if in this case, they do recommend death and it is a split verdict. If there is a 9 to help me do my math here, 9-3 split on this or something, and that just survives, I could see that absolutely being something that people will question. But again, it just always is seems problematic to me when you have legislators who are guided primarily by voters and wanting to gain popularity with voters, and they're doing something in response to public outrage. Not always a good way to create laws. Let's talk a little bit about his face tattoos, though, because that seems to be the reason this case is getting most of its attention. And you've seen this many times. I've seen this countless times in court. Defendants are often dressed for court. If they're in custody, they're not going to wear their county blues in court. They'll be given a suit and tie. Many times they'll get a haircut. Many times they'll shave. The idea of kind of changing appearance is not all that strange. Makeup is a new one for me. But how important do you think that is actually for a jury to see someone over there who appears to be clean cut, or if you have somebody who's got tattoos all over their face, including swastikas?
Well, this guy's tattoos, it's hard to be a human being and not be biased by his face. But the defense did it right, where they got out in front of the jury and said, listen, my client has these terrible tattoos. Are you going to hold this against him, or are you going to be able to base your verdict based on the evidence that's presented at trial and the evidence presented at trial alone? That being said, like you said, when we have an in-custody defendant, they are entitled to get out of their jailhouse uniform and wear a suit. And another thing that we do is we don't have the handcuffs or shackles visible, because they're entitled to the presumption of innocence. And a person wearing an orange jumpsuit or a jailhouse uniform with visible restraints could give the jury the wrong opinion of the person. So it's interesting in this case because tattoos are, it's at the discretion of the judge whether to cover them. But in many cases, tattoos are extremely probative to the case. A lot of times they go to the defendant's identification, gang affiliation, if that's a case, a hate crime. For instance, like this gentleman has a swastika. If it were a hate crime case, that would be relevant. The interesting thing is that many of these tattoos he put on his own face after being detained, knowing that he's going to be facing a jury likely for double murder. So at what point do we have to keep protecting someone against themselves?
Yeah, I mean, very good point. That is important, I think, to draw out too, is that this was all kind of a change in his appearance since he's been in custody, which I think speaks a lot to how he's spending his time in custody and who he may be associating with, especially if he's got swastikas on his face. But yeah, we ask a lot of jurors, and we ask a lot of them as far as don't carry any bias into court and please don't judge certain things. But listen, they're people, and they're going to be sitting there looking at this guy who's got the stitches and the swastikas, and I think they cannot help but subliminally be thinking to themselves, this looks like a bad dude who obviously doesn't care much about playing a normal role in society, and then he's got these horrible crimes that he's committed, if the circumstances of them that we didn't get into in too much detail here, but the circumstances are just absolutely brutal. So we will continue to follow that case. It is a fascinating one as always. And again, it's kind of testing this new law in Florida. So we'll make sure to keep everyone updated. Let's move to Indianapolis, Indiana, where disturbing messages allegedly exchanged between the mother and grandmother of a murdered child detail horrific abuse prosecutors argue were committed by the women. 5-year-old Kinsley Welty, who died of severe malnutrition and dehydration, was allegedly confined to a locked closet for extensive amounts of time and often bound with duct tape. Welty's mother, Toni McClure, faces murder, while the victim's grandmother, Tammy Helsey, faces 5 counts of neglect as well as a charge related to failing to report the abuse. Facebook messages allegedly sent between the adult women detail the torture endured by Welty before her death, including multiple references to taping the child up and placing objects in front of the closet where Welty was confined to keep the child in captivity. It is currently unclear if McClure or Helsey have entered pleas to the charges, but we will keep you updated to any developments. First off, Jessica, I know you've handled cases that involve abuse in the office as well. With this kind of evidence about a child and what the child may have suffered before their death, and now you've got these people kind of complaining about their care for the child and talking about the things that should be done to restrain her. Is this a case that you would expect might push a plea? You know what I'm saying? Is the evidence so overwhelming that you would expect a plea, or is this one of those things where their exposure is so great you expect a trial?
It's hard to say, because there are a lot of cases where we've had overwhelmingly terrible evidence that, it's ultimately the defendant's choice if they want to take it to trial. In this case, the death penalty is not on the table. I think that it will go to trial. I wouldn't be surprised if the boyfriend, who was also charged, or grandma roll on the mom. But it's horrible.
Yeah, and with the release of this new information too, realizing kind of the public outcry, I wonder, in many of these cases, somebody's going to cooperate, right? They know the time that they're looking at, and if that will save them at all, they're willing to, like you say, roll or turn on the mother in this case. Whenever we talk about cases that involve child abuse and systematic and sustained child abuse, this wasn't one anomaly in the way that this child was cared for that led to her death. It was a systematic abuse taking place over a long period of time. Apparently, according to reports, the child was 21 pounds when she died, a 5-year-old. Always we get asked the question, how did Child Services miss this? What are your thoughts on that? How do you deal with that as a prosecutor when it's like, what are these departments doing that they're missing these obvious cases?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. She suffered long-term abuse. She, at the time of her death, she weighed less than she did when she was 2 years old. So,
oh my God,
that's a long time that she had been being abused, and DCFS or DCS had been involved. My understanding is that the paternal grandparents had been given custody at least twice. I know that these agencies are short-staffed, just like prosecution agencies and a lot of public agencies, but there's really no excuse. And one of the issues that I think is kind of systematic is that the main goal is reunification with the parent. And the main goal has to be the health and safety of the child. And in this case, reunification should really not have been an option.
Yeah. Yeah. You make a good point. I'm not at all trying to say that their job is easy. I mean, no. I've seen both sides of it. I've seen situations where children are removed from the home and it's good, caring parents and something awful happened. some mistake. Not to get into war stories, but I represented a client where the mother had run inside of a store really quickly and left her child in the car for just a short moment instead of unbuckling. We all know how that is. Get him out of the car seat just to go inside real quick. While she was inside, someone stole the vehicle. And now there's this nightmare scenario, and she's got DCFS looking all over her to see, is this neglect? And the whole family had to go through that investigation. So you look at situations like that and you say, boy, they overextend themselves. And then you look at situations like this and you say, what are they doing? How are they missing this? So I understand they're understaffed. I understand that it's not an easy job, but 21 pounds. Less, like you said, less than she was at 2 years old. Go ahead.
And for instance, for your client, that was a one-time mistake.
Right.
Okay, so that's the difference. When you have repeated calls for abuse, you've had the child taken out of the home numerous times. I believe DCFS was even there on the day that she ultimately passed away. It's terrible. It is.
Yeah, these kinds of cases just break your heart too, because it's always a tragedy when a child is lost, but then when there seems like there would have been opportunities to save that and prevent it, it really, really breaks your heart. So again, we don't know where things stand on this. We don't even know if they're going to accept a plea, but we will continue to follow it and keep you all updated. Let's move to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where convicted armorer Hannah Gutierrez Reed is expected to testify in Alec Baldwin's upcoming manslaughter trial and reportedly wants to see the actor in jail. Reed, who is currently serving 18 months in prison after a jury found her guilty in the shooting death of Helena Hutchins, will be granted immunity in a move that could prove to be a headache for Baldwin's defense. Reed was previously on the witness list to testify, but invoked her Fifth Amendment privileges as she seeks to appeal her conviction. By granting Reed immunity, the prosecution can force her hand in testifying. Adding to the drama, Baldwin announced on Tuesday that he and his family will star in a reality show that is set to air next year. A jury will ultimately decide if the actor is held responsible in the shooting death next month, when the trial is set to begin on July 10th. The actor could face up to 18 months in prison if convicted. All right, Jessica, a lot to unpack here, and I'm glad that we have you on because as a prosecutor, you deal with this idea of granting immunity quite often. And I know in the DA's office in LA, at least, it's not used all that much. There's a lot of consideration into doing it. But help us understand here why the DA decided to grant her immunity, because the defense was actually trying to call her as a witness and banking on the fact that she would take the Fifth. Unwind all of that for us.
Well, the reason that the prosecution wants to give her use immunity, and use immunity means anything that she says during the Baldwin trial cannot be used against her, because her conviction is on appeal. So she doesn't want that. Because if she were alternately to not have that immunity, she could take the stand and plead the Fifth to every question, which would lend to the defense being able to claim that she was an unavailable witness. And when you have an unavailable witness, unavailable by a privilege, Fifth Amendment, spousal privilege, and whatnot, then the defense would be able to put into evidence snippets of her police interviews where she said things to the effect of, I should have checked the gun better. I mean, would be great for Baldwin's case. But if she took the Fifth, the prosecution could not then also put in snippets of any evidence that's bad for Baldwin. So the prosecution is playing it right by trying to give her use immunity.
Yeah, it's kind of, when you lay it out that way, and you did a great job, it's 3D chess taking place here, right? I mean, it's not so much that the prosecution wants her as a witness as much as they want to make sure she's an available witness so that the defense can't cherry pick the statements that she made before, because she made some statements that would have been favorable to Baldwin. How do you think this plays out now? Okay, so they call her, the defense. The prosecution grants her immunity, or I don't even know if we know who plans on calling her, right? It might even be the prosecution who calls her.
Yeah, she's on both of their witness lists, but that was a legal tactic. I think so.
Yeah. So maybe the prosecution even calls her to preempt all of this.
Yes.
And go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I mean, maybe they're trying to diffuse any defense argument with her statements by putting her on and having her explain away those kind of inculpatory statements she made before. What do you think?
That's correct. They're basically playing defense against the defense. Because if she pled the fifth and didn't have this use immunity, like I said, the defense could cherry pick what they wanted to put in that's going to help Alec Baldwin. And the prosecution would basically be robbed of the opportunity to cross-examine her and, sort out her testimony. So it would be, I'm sure the Baldwin team would be happy if the immunity was not granted. I can't see that it wouldn't, though.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Bit of legal maneuvering taking places between both sides here. Let's move though, because it's the defense has their own bag of worries with their client as well, because you've got a client who not only has done more than one police interview, or pardon me, news interview, media interview, talking freely about the circumstances of this case. Now he's saying that he intends to star in a reality TV show while his trial may be going on. If you're the defense attorney, I'm asking you to pretend to put on a defense attorney hat. I know that's so against your will here, but if you're the defense attorney, how much is this driving you nuts that you cannot keep your client's mouth shut?
That's a big problem. I would have never allowed my client to ever do a news interview, particularly if I weren't present. You can't unring that bell once you go out there. The television show with the children, I think it's more of a PR tactic. Look at me, I'm a dad, I'm a family man. Will he bring the cameras to court? Who knows?
You might be right. It might all be trying to paint him in a way, at least from a PR perspective, that seems like he's not a bad guy. I was also thinking too, he's probably got a lot of mounting legal bills, and maybe this is another way to get a little bit of income to pay for some of that. Who knows? But in our last question on this, do you have thoughts on whether or not they're going to actually prevail against him? Because my thinking on this case has always been, everybody views this as an accident. It's going to take a lot to prove criminal liability here. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. I think the prosecution has kind of been a mess from the beginning. I think it's a stretch. And I think that jurors are going to be hesitant to hold him responsible when there's an expert on set in charge of the guns. Yeah. So I think, how is he to have the belief that this gun has live ammo? He didn't, arguably have any reason to have that fear because they have an armorer on set for that purpose. I think it's going to be a tough case to try. I wouldn't want to try.
No, me neither. I have always said that if I'm his defense attorneys, I am going to find out every movie he's ever done where he's handled a gun, how many scenes he had with a gun, how many times he's been how many takes per scene, how many times has this man in his long career been handed a weapon on set and never, ever had a question in his mind that wasn't a safe thing to do. And now all of a sudden you're going to say, sir, you were unsafe in pointing the gun in this case and pulling the trigger. You should have known better. It's awful that a woman lost her life. It's awful that there was not good safety measures on this set. But I think to point the finger at the actor who just thinks he's being handed another prop gun is going a step too far.
I agree. And we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one there, and I imagine they will have cameras in court, and it will be entertaining to say the least. But in the meantime, Jessica, thank you so much. That is our show for this week. Where can people find out more about you?
That's a good question, Josh. As a prosecutor, I usually don't have anything where people can locate me, but I do now, as you know, have my Instagram, Jessica Bowlin ESQ, on Instagram.
Okay, well, check it out, folks. I'm a follower. In the meantime, I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And I have a special announcement. If you haven't already heard, if you would like to hear more of my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, you can also check me out at my new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. You can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and we want to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you again for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.